All right, hey guys, welcome back. This thing again. Okay. Welcome back. In our lecture today, we're going to finish up talking about the document that was created at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which was the Constitution. Historians are the worst at naming things. They're totally boring. Anyway, and I think last time we had gotten through the first 3 articles of the original 7 articles of the Constitution, which spelled out, if you'll recall, our 3 branches of government. They are separate branches dividing the power to legislate or make laws, giving it to Congress, the power to enforce the laws to a chief executive, the executive branch, the president, and the power to interpret the law, eventually given by judicial review to the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. So that's the first 3 articles of the Constitution. Now, you'll notice I don't have any notes for Article 4. I'm not going to go into super lot of depth about it right now. You'll cover more of that, I'm sure, in government class you'll have next year. But Article 4, if you want to put that in your notes, is basically the idea of federalism. And I mentioned the federal government all the time. That's referring to the national government. But when I put that ism on that word, federalism, that specifically entails the relationship between the national, state, and local governments, and the idea of how governmental power is shared between all those levels of government, particularly the national and the state governments. So as far as like, if you've ever heard of like jurisdiction, like who has control of what, that's where the idea that like state governments have the power over education. The national government has the power over waging war and trade and international things. Each government has its own roles to play. And Article 4 of the Constitution kind of spells out like, hey, states, I know this is a big, strong, new central government, unlike those weak articles. Don't be scared, though. You'll still have your independence. You'll still have your role to play. And this is how that's going to work. Article 4 also kind of spelled out, remember the Northwest Ordinance, and that was critical under the articles for like how to add new states eventually to the Union. Article 4 of the Constitution will kind of take that and spell out how new states can be added to the country. So that's the federalism article. Okay, so we have 7 articles of the Constitution. We've gotten through 4 of them. Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2, executive branch. Article 3, judicial. Article 4, federalism. Here we are, Article 5, the amendment process. How to alter or change this government. And this is probably the most important thing, the most intellectual, astounding, amazing, great, awesome thing. If you want to compliment the founding fathers, if you want to say they were great men, you could argue that. Some were slave owners, some had this problem, some had that problem, whatever. But if you want to say that they were truly great, here it is in Article 5, having the foresight to acknowledge that you're creating something that is meant to last in perpetuity, that is meant to last forever. And if something lasts forever, it has to be adaptable. It has to be able to change. If it can't change, it will die. We will have to create a new government, and there will be chaos, there'll be revolution, many souls will be lost. You have to create a government that can endure, and the only way to do that is to create a government that can change. So that's the amendment process. It's how to change the Constitution, how to alter it. And it is a very difficult process. Remember, under the original Articles of Confederation government, it took unanimous vote from the Confederation Congress, like all 13 states, in order to amend the articles. Under the Constitution, it's not unanimous consent, but again, it's very hard. In order to propose an amendment, it's going to take 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives, remember that lower house, and the Senate, to propose an amendment. Or you could have 2/3 of the state governments propose the amendment. So those are the 2 ways to propose, and that takes a lot to get even a proposal. Then once you have that proposal, to actually ratify or enact that proposal and make it part of the Constitution, changing the government, changing the Constitution, you must get 3/4 of the states to ratify. 3/4 of the state governments or 3/4 of state conventions, which I believe only happened for prohibition. But yeah, prohibition is the 18th Amendment, banned alcohol, and then we bring it back because that was a very a bad idea. It led to a lot of crime, Al Capone and the gangsters in the 1920s. So we repealed the 18th Amendment. The only time that's ever happened, when we actually took back an amendment. The only way to, it's crazy, right? But the only way to undo an amendment is to create a new amendment. And so that's what the 21st Amendment was for. It got rid of the 18th. So then alcohol was made legal again, because so we could tax it during the Great Depression. Anyway, so with this criteria in place, the steps involved in order to pass an amendment, this is why there's only been, since 1791, when the Bill of Rights was first added to the Constitution, all the way until 2020, there has only been 27 amendments added to the Constitution. It is incredibly, incredibly difficult to get an amendment. However, I mean, the 27 amendments prove it's not impossible. And these amendments that have been added are so important. They have done things like end slavery in America. They've done things like asserted due process, that you're born here, you're a citizen, you're entitled to all the same protections under the law as all other citizens. They've done things like giving women the right to vote. It's the 19th Amendment. Making sure 18-year-olds have the right to vote. These are the amendments that we've added since the inception of our country, and they have fundamentally altered our government, but they haven't rewritten completely our government. They've just changed or added to it. So again, that's the importance of the 5th article of the Constitution. It spells out how to change our government, how to make it better. All right. Oops. Oh, we'll talk more about it, but there were some original amendments that were proposed that get added way later, like the 27th, I believe. Anyway, Article 6 of the Constitution. Again, it's not right here in the notes, but you might want to add it in your own. This can go bye-bye because it's really annoying me. Article 6 deals with the Supremacy Clause. Basically, the idea that the Constitution is the highest authority in our country. So remember back to Article 4 and federalism, power shared between the national and state governments. Which one is superior? Which one, if a little green alien beams down and says, "Take me to your leader," I mean, do you take him to your state of Austin capital, or do you take him to Washington, D.C.? Where do you take the little green man? You go to Washington, D.C., you take him to the National Archives, and you show him the Constitution, this old document, and you say, that is our government. That's what's created our government. That is the highest law, the highest authority in all of the United States is this document, the Constitution. And it says it right there in Article 6 that it is the highest. So that is the Supremacy Clause. Also in Article 6, it lays out how to divest ourselves of those monumentous debts from the Revolutionary War. Something that will plague us moving forward. And then finally, Article 7, and this is the last major point of contention. Remember, we talked about several stumbling blocks on the way to getting this Constitution made. We had the big state versus small state crisis. We had the issue over representation when counting slaves that ended with the 3/5 compromise. Well, here's the final stumbling block to the Constitution: ratification. And that's spelled out in Article 7. To ratify means to pass, to make like official. Okay, let's do this thing. Let's have the Constitution enacted. Let's make this our government. But in order to ratify it, they needed the majority. They needed 3/4 of the states. They needed at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify. Never mind that like Rhode Island here. Rhode Island never even showed up to the Constitutional Convention, but they still get a chance to ratify it or not. But they got to pass this thing in the states. And this is a hard sell, because remember, what they're doing is throwing away a government in the Articles that was super weak as far as central power went, that had state governments with most of the power, and replacing it with the exact opposite, a strong national government that threatened states' rights. And so there will be a rising faction of people throughout the states who were opposed to this, who did not want the Constitution, who thought that it would be a return to monarchy and the British Empire. I mean, some of the most famous American patriots were very, very upset by the idea of a constitution. I'm talking like Patrick Henry. Remember, "Give me liberty or give me death," Patrick Henry from Virginia. He did not like the Constitution at all. In fact, when he heard about the delegates meeting in Philadelphia for this convention in 1787, he famously said, "I smell a rat in Philadelphia." Basically saying he doesn't trust what they're doing. Remember, they were meeting in secrecy because they knew what they were doing was going to be contentious. So those that opposed the passage of the Constitution, they were called the Anti-Federalists. You'll never guess what those who wanted the Constitution passed were called. Oh, wait, you did. They're called the Federalists. That's right. So it's the Federalists who want the Constitution versus the Anti-Federalists. And already from the names, you see the Federalists kind of have the advantage because they're not against something. So in this debate, it's in the states, got to get the states, at least 9 of them, to pass it. You're going to see a lot of essays floating around on both sides, trying to convince people, through their arguments, whether or not this Constitution was going to be a good idea. And one of the major points that a lot of the Anti-Federalists had, like, against the Constitution, was that in all of those 7 articles, I did not mention anything about guaranteeing protections to individual people in our country. There's nothing in those 7 articles, for instance, that mentioned anything about freedom of the press, or freedom of speech, or the right to bear arms, or no quartering of soldiers, or no unlawful searches or seizures, or the right to a fair trial by a jury of your peers, or so on and so forth, right? We know those rights are given to us today. Those are rights that cannot be taken away from us by our government because they exist in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights, remember, that's what the first 10 amendments are to the Constitution. They were add-ons. That's what an amendment is, an add-on. They were not originally part of the document. And so Anti-Federalists pointed this out. There's like, hey, we just created a government that has all this power and no protections for the people. Now, some Federalists argued back that, like, hey, if we have to spell out every protection that a person is guaranteed, we'll be omitting something. So by listing them out, we're actually limiting the protections a person can have. But still, Anti-Federalists persisted, saying, no, we lived through British tyranny. We need to make sure we avoid this, and that our government spells out, the things that it cannot take away from its citizenry. And so that's why many of the Anti-Federalists, they said they would only support this Constitution in their states if it included a Bill of Rights, those guaranteed protections that I was just listing. Why is it doing that today? I don't know. Okay. So that is how we end up in this debate over ratification in 1788, 1789. In New York and Pennsylvania especially, you start to see a lot of these anonymous letters circulating from Anti-Federalists, and they started to use pseudonyms. That's like a fake name you give yourself to make sure people don't know it's you. No, gosh, stop it. Can you, like, go, whatever. Okay, sorry. All right. They started using pseudonyms of Roman senators and famous Roman and Greek figures. Some of the most famous Anti-Federalist essays were written by under the pseudonym Brutus and Cato. Brutus was one of the people who actually betrayed Julius Caesar and stabbed him in the name of the Roman Republic. Not the best person to be naming your stuff after, but anyway. So the Federalist Papers were the answer to these arguments against the Constitution, against this strong central government. And they were written by three individuals under the pseudonym, the collective pseudonym, Publius, which means like from the public. And the three authors of these papers defending the Constitution, the Federalist argument, the Federalist Papers, were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, all very, very important founding fathers. Alexander Hamilton, remember, he was like George Washington's right-hand man, his aide-de-camp. He's going to be a very important figure under Washington's administration as our first Treasury Secretary. You had James Madison, who is the father of this Constitution with his Virginia plan and all of his studious note-taking, one of the biggest defenders of this new, stronger central government. And then our future fourth president of the United States, little James Madison. And then finally, the third was John Jay, who was one of the people responsible for the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, a key representative and delegate from New York, and he will go on to become, again, a very important negotiator under Washington, but also our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. So these three men take it upon themselves here in New York to basically defend the Constitution. They write under the pseudonym Publius, and they publish a series of, I believe, it's like something like 85 essays. You had Hamilton writing most of them because he's a voracious writer. He wrote like 51 of the essays, some of them more important and studied than others. James Madison wrote 29 of the essays, including Federalist Number 10, which is seen as one of the seminal works about avoiding tyranny of the majority. And then John Jay, he wrote 5. He actually got sick after his fourth one, managed one more, and then he had to drop out. But these essays kind of, I don't know how impactful they were at the time for convincing people to support the Constitution while, you know, they were having this ratification debate, but they're incredibly important for historians because they give us insight directly from I mean, you know, father of the Constitution here, James Madison. We get insight into what he was thinking, why he made these stipulations in our government. Why is that important? Well, this spells out like how we've been ruled since 1789, since Washington was sworn in. Why our government has, you know, this weird process to elect the president, the Electoral College, why we have a bicameral Congress, and why all these things in our government operate the way they do. You know, if you have complaints about the government, I've got a few. We can look at these arguments to see what the founding fathers had intended and why they set it up the way they did. So they are very valuable in that kind of setting. All right. Now, they will be able to ratify. The first state to ratify is Delaware. So if you ever see on like trivia or like coins or something that Delaware is the first state, that's why they were the first ones to ratify. And then it all came down to the big states. You didn't have Virginia, New York. You didn't have anything really. But then finally they give in, they ratify. There was also the understanding that the first president chosen by the Electoral College would be George Washington, which helped assuage a lot of people's fears. And then finally, through all of this, we get our new government, this strong central authority, this government that will endure because it can adapt, the Constitution of the United States. But it was only from the promise that the Federalists made to the Anti-Federalist that there would be attached to it a Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So I want to go over them briefly. They do get added officially as promised in 1791. They were actually written, I think, almost entirely. I mean, he had help, but they were written by James Madison. So again, James Madison coming in for the save. Let me move that over here. Okay. So these are our first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They get added just 2 years after the Constitution. goes into effect, and it's officially ratified when these get added. First Amendment is your 5 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom to petition your government if you have grievances, freedom of the press, the news, to report what's going on. A free press is vital for a democracy, although you'd hope that your press will be well informed and responsible. Let's see, freedom to assemble, like for protest purposes. And let's see, freedom of speech, it's freedom of religion. The freedom of religion to worship the way you choose, so that we wouldn't have these bickering problems like back in Europe between Catholics and Protestants and these other things. That's why religion, you have a separation of church and state in the public sphere, like in schools. We'll talk more about this later, but those are your 5 freedoms. The Second Amendment's the right to bear arms. Remember, with Lexington and Concord, with militias and Minutemen. The Second Amendment actually says that in order to have a well-regulated militia, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Obviously, a lot has changed in the 200 plus years since the Bill of Rights was written. When it was originally written, people needed to have guns in order to defend their communities because there was no police force. I mean, heck, the idea of like a national military was even kind of something they were figuring out. So that was a vital necessity for their communities, as well as to hunt and get food. Remember, there weren't supermarkets at this time. Not everybody hunted for food, but it was much more commonplace than like today. So times have changed, and it is under debate what the Second Amendment means today, especially with all the mass shootings that we have in our country. But that's why it was part of the original Constitution. The Third Amendment also is kind of part of its time. It's antiquated, but it says no quartering of soldiers. Remember the Quartering Act and its variations, that literally British troops were supposed to be housed under the colony's dime. Well, this says that soldiers cannot take your beds. So that's the Third Amendment. Not that you were worried about that happening, hopefully. The Fourth Amendment, no unlawful searches or seizures. The Fourth Amendment is a direct response to those terrible writs of assistance, those messed up search warrants. This made sure that search warrants had to be gotten by judges through the proper channels. And that also has extended in time to other areas for protection of privacy. So you have an inherent right to privacy to your home. You have a right to privacy of your vehicle. You have a right to privacy on your property, and you have a right to privacy also in your own person, as we'll talk about later with like the very important Roe v. Wade in case of abortion. The Fifth Amendment is about the rights of the accused, as is the Sixth, Seventh, and Eighth Amendments. So these are all dealing with your right to a fair trial. We'll go into detail on them later, but some of the most important things to remember: the Fifth Amendment, what you always see on the television shows, they say, I plead the Fifth. They're saying, I have a right to remain silent. Your Miranda rights comes from the case of Miranda v. Arizona later on in like the latter half of the 20th century. You have the right to remain silent because anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. So that's from the Fifth Amendment. Whoops. There we go. And the Fifth Amendment also has some other very important things. It mentions due process, that all people should be treated fairly under the law. It mentions eminent domain, that the government can take your property away, but it must compensate you fairly. And it also mentions another thing as well, famous with the O.J. Simpson trial in the 1990s, the idea of no double jeopardy. That if you have been tried and acquitted for a crime, you cannot be tried again for that same crime. No double jeopardy. So that's all part of the Fifth Amendment. It's a big one. Sixth Amendment, easy enough to remember on the surface. It's the right to a fair and speedy trial. Remember how some of the ways the British would abuse this, they would send colonists on trial to foreign courts in Canada or across the ocean in London. They also were heard by a very biased royal judge instead of a jury of their colonial peers. And going to Canada or back to Britain, they would also have to wait months on end before going to trial. So the Sixth Amendment is a fair and speedy trial. Seventh Amendment, you have the right to a jury in civil proceedings. So you get sued, whatever, you have the right to be judged by a jury of your peers, people who are like you. You're not going to be judged by a biased, judge. Now it can be judged by, I'll just stop there, but a jury of your peers, a jury. And that's why if you've ever had your parents, summoned for jury duty, that's what they're doing. They're serving on a jury as their civic duty to basically judge the guilt or innocence of a fellow citizen. That is something that we all must do from time to time when we get those jury summons. And while it might be super boring, there are some advantages to jury duty. You're doing your part. You're also getting paid a little bit, not much. And the best part, you also get out of work and your boss cannot penalize you for that because you are performing a civic function, your civic responsibility. So that's the Seventh Amendment. The Eighth Amendment says no cruel or unusual punishment, and also no excessive fines or bails. So the Eighth Amendment is often cited when cases of torture are presented, like with Guantanamo Bay. That's why we hold our torture facility off American soil. The Eighth Amendment also is why the method of execution has changed throughout American history. It was death by hanging, then it became the electric chair. Today it's lethal injection, and tomorrow, because of the Eighth Amendment and our better understanding as we go through medical science about what is humane and what is not, who knows what tomorrow may bring. Maybe we might end executions altogether. But that's all surrounding the Eighth Amendment. And then the Ninth and 10th are different. They're not about the rights of the accused. They actually are about some more macro issues. The Ninth Amendment says, of everything we talked about, if something has not been mentioned so far in the Constitution, that doesn't mean that it's not a right that you as a citizen of our country have. Okay, so the Ninth Amendment is rights kept by the people. Okay, like just for instance, just because the Constitution doesn't mention you can't breathe, doesn't mean you can't breathe. Okay, so that's the Ninth Amendment covering us. The 10th Amendment says the exact same thing, but instead of people, it's the states. So any right not mentioned in the Constitution is a right that can be kept by the states. And that is why the states have jurisdiction over like schools, public schools and education. That's why states have jurisdiction over marriage licenses and death certificates and driver's licenses and all those other things, because nowhere in the Constitution are they talked about. So that gives the states the rights to those things. That's the 10th Amendment, sometimes just called the States' Rights Amendment. Okay, so that is the Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists refused to agree to the Constitution until a Bill of Rights was added. Federalists promised a Bill of Rights. James Madison wrote it up and it got added. There were two additional amendments that Madison wrote. One of them never got added. The other one got added over 200 years later. That actually became the 27th Amendment. And the 27th Amendment that Madison wrote actually detailed how there should not be a raise in the same congressional session for congressmen, so that congressmen couldn't raise their salaries in the same term that they got elected. Kind of trying to keep things fair on their payment. And of course, the other thing besides the Bill of Rights that also made a lot of people feel better about the new government, the Constitution, was the fact that our first chief executive, we're really, really worried about this chief executive thing. Is he going to turn into a new monarch? Is he going to be a king? Was going to be George Washington. And this was everybody's understanding. The election that had the biggest blowout, unanimous support, like who won the presidency, the best, it was George Washington. I mean, there were some other contenders. I think John Hancock thought he might get to be vice president or something. But George Washington was always assumed to be our first president. Remember, he's been involved in national politics since before we were a nation. He started the French and Indian War, God bless him. But he was our commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, making do with nothing, funding his army with his own, out of his pocket, going blind in service to his nation, like he read about when he stopped uh, that that coup from the military with the Nuremberg conspiracy. He's always been the tallest guy in the room, a natural leader. He's always been dignified and poised and self-sacrificing to an extent. And so he made the obvious choice. But remember, George Washington also was very reluctant to do this. He was reluctant to go to Philadelphia in the first place, to the convention. He had to be kind of convinced by his good little surrogate son there, Alexander Hamilton, just to go. And he presided over the convention. When they elect him in 1789 to be the first president, he's really torn because he wants to go back to Virginia. He wants to go back to his plantation at Mount Vernon and kind of retire, be out of the public eye, get some rest, and do the things he enjoyed, like riding his horse and managing his farm and all that other stuff. So that is Washington coming in as president of the United States. First inaugural ball, all this. His vice president will be the tenacious Massachusetts lawyer, John Adams. And they get sworn in the federal capital, New York. That's right, because Washington, D.C., named after George Washington, was not yet built. So they get sworn in a federal hall in New York City. And Washington is going to be the first president, so he's going to kind of set the tenor and example for what future presidents will follow. This is what we call a precedent. So Washington is often referred to as the precedent president because he's setting all these examples. And one of the most important early things that he does is he sets up a cabinet, a group of semi-official advisors to help him run the country, because he's the executive. He's got to enforce all the laws of the country. He's going to need some people to delegate power to. And so Washington's cabinet, it was much smaller than the cabinet we have today. Like today we have 15 cabinet departments. Washington did not have 15. But some of them were pretty important. He has the Department of State. So the Secretary of State leads that. And for his Secretary of State position, it's going to be Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who penned the famous letter from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson, who'd been under the Articles, our ambassador to France, and had been helping in their revolution, and Lafayette and all that. Thomas Jefferson, in fact, the French Revolution is gearing up at this moment. It hasn't quite yet started yet, but he will be heavily involved with all that. But Thomas Jefferson will be our Secretary of State, our first Secretary of State. Henry Knox, the guy who was miraculous in making the cannons get down from Fort Ticonderoga down to Boston, the whiz king of logistics. He's going to be our first Secretary of War. We had a War Department. In World War II, we'll change this to the Department of Defense. Sounds a little better, but that's what that was. So Henry Knox for Secretary of War. And then Secretary of the Treasury, it's going to be Alexander Hamilton, Washington's right-hand man, the guy who had wanted to call, because there was a big debate at the Constitutional Convention, what do we call the president? They didn't have the idea at first for president. The idea was, well, do we call him prime minister? Do we call him his excellency? Do we call him his highness, like he's a king? What do we call him? Hamilton had been in favor, I think, of your highness. He was very in favor of almost a British monarchical system of government in general. But Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, the immigrant from the Caribbean, will be our Secretary of the Treasury. And then finally, to round out the prominent cabinet positions under Washington, the Attorney General, like the top lawyer of the nation, will be Edmund Randolph, or the guy who presented Madison's Virginia Plan, one of the great early governors of Virginia. Edmund Randolph will be the Attorney General. So Washington's got the A squad for his cabinet, and we are ready to go. We'll stop the lecture there today, guys, and we'll get into Washington's presidency next time. Thank you guys very much. I will talk to you later. Bye.